Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. Anyway, one of my viewers asked me to make a video about how Hawaii became a part of the United States. Now, I did warn this person, it's not a topic about which I know a great deal, but I'm going to do it anyway. I make it a point of pride not to look things up before I do these videos. So spontaneity is what I'm all about. To show that I have the ability to improvise and then respond to things that are coming along. I don't want to be over rehearsed. Poor optics, that's part of my package. You know, that's me. So doing these little things always in a single take. Some people are so polished and I think they're perhaps over prepared. So I'm never lost at something to say. And this will be much shorter than my usual videos because sometimes I'm going on for over an hour and I think that's too lengthy. At the end I was saying, something else I should have mentioned about, say, Napoleon and deficit finance. Okay, so Hawaii, well, there is the island of Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, but it also gives its name to an archipelago. There's several islands, so it could be confusing. You talk about Hawaii Island or the group of several islands. I'm excluding the islets. If to include the very tiny islands, it would be also up to dozens, but you know, many of these are uninhabited. So aloha, both hello and goodbye. I've never been to Hawaii, unfortunately. My time in the United States, well, I've only visited New England, visited all the states of New England, been to New York City, Washington, D.C. I've been into Virginia, to Mount Vernon. That's George Washington's residence, in case you didn't know. So obviously it's an enormous country. I wish to revisit the United States. Where would I go? So placed in Florida, perhaps, you know, Miami. Some would say, oh, Sarasota, or places on that side of the Floridian coast are more alluring, the Florida Keys. New Orleans seems absolutely intriguing, and it's long since recovered from that hurricane. Was it Katrina? Way back in 2005. Anywhere in Texas, I'm not sure some of the major cities, because, well, not giving away too much, but some members of my family lived in Texas way back in the 70s, before I was around. Where was it? They were in Corpus Christi, Winsboro, San Antonio. But I'm not wishing to be disparaging, but I don't know there's much that appeals to me about those cities. Las Vegas, okay, viva Las Vegas. And by the way, it's not Las Vegas, it's Las Vegas. It's feminine, come on, the plains. And places in California, like San Francisco, LA, of course, any of the major attractive towns on the coast. I'm not sure where else I'd like to go. I know Chicago's a huge city, and I'm a big city person by inclination, but I think that metropolis doesn't offer a great deal to the tourist. Perhaps I'm being unfair. I may be showing my ignorance. Okay, Niagara Falls as well, and then cross over into Canada. Not that that's terribly close to Chicago, but yeah, I think probably a lot of the interior wouldn't appeal to me a great deal. Anyway, I might see Richmond, Virginia, because I spent so much time in Richmond upon Thames. I'm fairly curious about the American Civil War. Very anti-Confederate, by the way. Okay, so back to Hawaii. These islands in the Pacific Ocean. It seems demi-paradisical. It's got volcanoes, like so many Pacific islands. It means there's very fertile soil from that volcanic ash. You'd think people would have taken leave of their senses to live near volcanoes, but so long as you're not caught in an eruption, you're all right, and then things are going to grow much better. So I know in their language, they don't have certain letters. I remember that film North, starring Elijah Wood, absolutely donkey's years ago, in which some chap said, it's better for your grades to live in Hawaii because we have a letter A, we have no B, C, or D, so you can only get an A or an E, so you're more or less guaranteed to get A's. Okay, he was being flippant when he said that. So I know Honolulu is the biggest city. What are the other islands? There's Maui, Oahu, the others I don't know. But anyway, so they're Polynesians, those people. There are many Polynesian peoples in the Pacific Ocean, as in it comes from many islands in Greek. Polys are many and Nesia is islands. They're not Melanesians, people from black islands, or Micronesians, people from small islands. These are all various families of nations in the Pacific Ocean. So they've been there, living there for millennia, and they probably came from mainland Asia a very long time ago. Obviously, so distant related to the people of East Asia and to the people who got to the mainland of the American continent. So some of these Polynesian languages are similar. What else was I going to say? So Europeans first started exploring this area in the early 18th century, Famously, there was that British Royal Naval officer, Captain James Cook, who was there in the late 18th century, one of his lengthy Pacific voyages, and had met the people, got along reasonably well with him. Then they started to be suspicious, thinking that he was going to try to annex their land, and he went ashore to gather provisions. But anyway, Captain Cook was killed there, and his sailors were unable to recover his body. And then his body was then cooked and eaten. And actually, the Hawaiians, even though they'd killed him, they held him in very high esteem, and they boiled his bones and kept them for a long time. I'm not sure if they were ever recovered and sent back to his home. So that's famously, Captain Cook was killed in Hawaii. Perhaps this is why Hawaii is the only state in the United States to have the British flag as part of its state flag. It's there in the ensign, the top left-hand corner. But anyway, through the 19th century, by the time the United States was independent, American sailors and merchants began going there more and more. They began to rent and purchase land and set up plantations. The Hawaiians had their own lifestyle, not terribly inclined to toil in these plantations. And so people became as indentured laborers or bonded laborers from mainland Asian countries. People came from China and Japan and so on. I know Japan's a very wealthy country, but people forget that until after the Second World War, it was not wealthy at all. I know in the Second World War it was militarily mighty and had a formidable military manufacturing industry. But apart from that, it was a very typical East Asian country. Most people did not live well at all, lived in ordinary little wooden houses. Very few people had any gizmos, any labor-saving devices and things like that. It's only the late 20th century that Japan struck it rich. So a lot of people in Japan were living in penury, which is why they might choose to be laborers on plantations in Hawaii and elsewhere, and people coming from the Philippines and other parts of East Asia to work there. So American business interests became more and more involved in Hawaii, and some of the Hawaiian royal family became a little bit alarmed by this. The United States was also eager to gain control of Hawaii, lest it be taken by others. Remember, Germany owns some islands in the Pacific Ocean, right? The Caroline Islands, what's now American Samoa, the northern part of Papua New Guinea, they call it Kaiserville and the Second Land. Obviously, the Spanish had some islands in the Pacific. Well, they had the Philippines until the Spanish-American War. The British, the French had a presence, the French in Tahiti, or the Society Islands, they sometimes call them New Caledonia and so on. And after the First World War, the Germans lost these islands according to the Treaty of Versailles. Some of them given to the Japanese, some to the British, some to the Australians. Australians obviously count as part of the British Empire at the time. But anyway, by the late 19th century, the United States decided, well, we better make sure this is clearly ours so nobody else can get in. Also, the Hawaiian royal family don't say we're going to sign a treaty with Germany or Spain or whoever it is. So the United States declared it to be annexed. It was a territory of the United States. Notice it was a territory of the United States, not a state of the United States. But by that stage, American citizens were only a minority of those living there. Now, American citizens there almost overwhelmingly meant white, and not even Hispanic white either, because very few African Americans had moved to Hawaii by that stage. And there were very few Chinese and Japanese immigrants to the United States at that stage, and they often found it very difficult to obtain citizenship. Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans, well, they weren't, sometimes weren't regarded as American at the time. Remember, there's a Chinese Exclusion Act roughly the same time. That was that. And to be a territory of the United States, you had to have at least 5,000 American citizens living there, be reasonably politically organized, apply to Congress, would Congress accept you? And that was often a way station towards becoming a state of the United States. We all know that the United States started out with 13 colonies, which became 13 states, and that baker's dozen expanded to the west, and territories would be admitted as a territory and then could be upgraded to a state after some time if Congress agreed. And of course, after the American Civil War became rather easier because there wasn't that vexatious question of slavery. Is it to be admitted as a free state or a slave state? Well, that was all gone. Slavery was outlawed. People were still living there as bonded laborers, sometimes having a dreadful time. Obviously, the United States wasn't the only place to have people in some semi-servitude. In some British colonies, such as South Africa or Trinidad and Tobago, in the early 20th century, some people were still living in these dreadful conditions and abysmally paid. Some people in the Pacific Ocean were blackbirding. I'm not aware if that happened in relation to Hawaii. It's like some Australians would go to a Melanesian island and simply kidnap people and take them and force them to be slaves working in plantations. Even though that was illegal, it still went on in the late 19th century. So the Queen of Hawaii was not terribly happy about this, but there was really nothing she could do. She couldn't militarily resist the Americans. Some indigenous Hawaiians thought it was a good thing. Some of them were fairly Americanized, and the English language began to spread and blah, blah, blah. And obviously these indigenous people of Hawaii, they eventually became citizens. What else was I going to say? So there's still a royal palace in Honolulu. Anyway, through the early 20th century, more and more people from the United States itself began to move there. So what's the situation if you're a territory? Then if you're born there, then you are an American citizen, unless your parents are foreign diplomats or something. And obviously you can move, in those days you could move from Hawaii to the United States and had the right to live there, work there, all the rest of it. People from the United States itself could move to Hawaii, had the right to work there and live there, and didn't have to apply to be allowed to go. The one thing is obviously Hawaii, the people there were not allowed to vote for the president, and they didn't have any senators. They used the US dollar, English their official language, that's that. But at first there wasn't much thought of upgrading it to a state. But in the 1930s, well, part of the New Deal, Roosevelt had more things built in Hawaii. They began to build up Pearl Harbor as a US naval base. The United States was increasingly worried about the growing might of Japan, wondering if the Japanese had hostile intentions toward the United States. And of course, there was a significant Japanese community in Hawaii. Some Americans suspected them being fifth columnists, and actually some of these Japanese people were. So Japan had a long-term plan from the early 20th century of sending Japanese people to settle in other parts of the Asia-Pacific region, including Malaya, for example, or Malaysia as it is now, then a British colony. There's a famous story told by Frederick Forsyth, that British author. So Forsyth's father was working in Malaya in the 1930s as a plantation manager, and there was a Japanese family, and their child fell very, very ill, and they had no means to get him to a doctor. So Mr. Forsyth took this child on his motorbike in the middle of the night. He rode for many miles to deliver this child to a doctor, and the boy's life was saved. And the Japanese man said, I want to thank you so much. I'm a very poor man. I can't reward you, but the only thing I can do is give you advice. Please leave Malaysia. If you value your life, just take my advice. Leave Malaysia now. And that Mr. Forsyth did move back to the United Kingdom, because that Japanese guy was a sleeper agent. He'd been sent by the Japanese government, get a job in Malaysia, any government, because one day we're going to invade. Obviously, you mustn't breathe a word of this, but one day we're going to invade, we're going to defeat the British, and their civilians are going to be sent to labor camps and blah, blah, blah. So that's how the Japanese guy was helping that Mr. Forsyth out. Forsyth out probably saved his life. And to some extent, the plan was the same for Hawaii. I'm not saying that all Japanese people resident there were involved in this, aware of this at the time. Anyway, so what's the next step? Well, we all know about the attack on Pearl Harbor, 7th of December, 1941. As FDR said, a day that shall live in infamy. You should watch that film about it, Tora, 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 which came out about 20 years after the attack. Tora, 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 meaning tiger, tiger, tiger in the Japanese language, when there had been increasingly bad relations between the United States and Japan for several years leading up to that. Remember, China had annexed Manchuria, the north east province of China, which was rich in coal and oil and fairly industrialized. Manchukuo, the Japanese called it. They put Puyi, the former Chinese emperor, on the throne there, but really he was their marionette. Anyway, in 1937, they'd invaded a major part of China, and the Republic of China was at war against them. Chiang Kai-shek was the president of China, and his wife, she was a Chinese American. She'd been to Wellesley, if I got that right. So obviously spoke perfect English, and she was touring the United States, propagandizing for the Chinese cause and liking her husband to George Washington. But anyway, the Americans sympathized heavily with the Chinese. There are quite a few American missionaries bringing the Bible to the Chinese, and they felt the Japanese were very anti-Christian, had viciously persecuted Christianity in their own country. Anyway, that was that, and that's why in 1941, relations went south between the US and Japan, and then President Roosevelt said we're no longer going to sell oil to the Japanese, which was a great problem for the Japanese war machine. And so the Nipponese thought, well, we've got to do something about this. The Great Empire of Japan, as they called it, they planned their attack on Pearl Harbor. I think it was Admiral Yamamoto carried it out. actually not that successful. I think I'm correct in saying they only actually managed to sink 2 US warships. They damaged several, and they thought it was going to take a couple of years to repair them, but the dockyards worked so fast, they managed to repair them just in a few months. The US aircraft carriers were out on exercise then, and so they didn't get sunk. 5 Japanese miniature submarines, midget submarines, were sunk as part of the attack. Destroyed quite a few US aircraft. But that was that Sunday, the 7th of December, a surprise attack. No declaration of war, simply attack. That was the Japanese way of doing it. They'd done the same when they attacked the Russians in 1904, or then in 1941, they also attacked, say, the British possessions in Asia in the same way, without any declaration of war. And this is why it was thought to be so treacherous, as President Roosevelt said, whilst their representatives were in a parley with ours, assuring us of their Pacific attention, they plotted this dastardly attack. Anyway, so that was quite important in the Second World War. If the Japanese had actually seized the island invaded by land, then that would have helped them a lot. So we know that obviously the United States won, and then after the Second World War, the United States became even more prosperous. It lifted out of the Great Depression, and a lot more tourists started coming to Hawaii, and so the military put so much money in there, became a wealthier place. Seems a lovely place to be. So fertile and just an idyllic temperature, and obviously that they'd invented surfing there, which became popular elsewhere. And they don't seem to suffer from shark attacks over much. But anyway, in the 1950s it was debated, should it become a state of the United States, no longer just a territory. The population had risen quite a lot, and some people there were agitating for statehood. So in 1959, it was looked at for both Alaska, which is a territory at the time, and Hawaii. And in 1959, they both became states. Not the same day. There was a few months between them. And they're the last states to be admitted to the Union. And the big debate these days is, should Puerto Rico become a state? Because 9 years ago, Puerto Rico applied to be admitted as a state of the United States, and it still hasn't happened. But I think the Republican Party is very loath to permit that, because they know that Puerto Rico breaks very heavily towards the Democrats, something like 75%. Be 2 more senators with the Democrats. Puerto Rico would have about 4 representatives, and I would think at least 3 of them would be Democrats, and blah, blah, blah. Obviously tip the presidential election that way. So that's that. So Hawaii is very, very mixed in ethnicity, and it's the only place where in the US, I think I'm right in saying, where whites are the minority. No, sorry, it's not. Where Asians are the largest single group, a plurality, and whites are a minority there, as whites, non-Hispanic whites are a minority in various places, such as California, and I can't think where else, maybe South Carolina. So yeah, so a lot of Asian Americans, as in Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, indigenous Hawaiian people, and so on. So yeah, it's a similar story you'd find in many parts of the Pacific, okay, whether it's Western Samoa or American Samoa, which is still, or Nauru, Palau, Kiribati, some of these groups of Pacific islands which are, how to put it, these commonwealths, and they're in a relationship with the United States. They're not a state as such. They rely on the US for foreign affairs, for defense, and so on. And there seems to be little thought of them becoming a state. Okay, so that's all about Hawaii. I told you I didn't know much about it.